We've been working in China for approximately 10 years. We started working in China just after the completion of Federation Square in Melbourne. The big offices in China, the Chinese offices, the local design institutes, the LDI, they have so many projects that there's always available work. As a foreign, you kind of go through ebbs and flows in terms of opportunity. You have to have persistence. You have to be committed to the place. I mean, even though there's this huge amount of projects and opportunities here, you can't expect to be able to just walk in off the plane the first time and get a project. You have to form relationships, and the way in which those relationships form are really important to how your long-term success is. China is a culture where government links and sort of government support has a big effect. So there's a huge market, but at the same time having the support of the state of Victoria, for instance, makes a big difference in terms of the entree into the market, but also in terms of how you're perceived as having credibility, as having substantiality, and something that they trust sort of almost implicitly because you seem to be supported by the state government. China absolutely operates differently than Australia or Europe. I mean, you know, in Australia, it's a cardinal rule that you would never do a shopping mall that's more than 3 levels high because nobody goes above that. In China, it's very easy to do a 9-story, 11, 15-story shopping mall, and the top 3 layers are just restaurants and they're full all the time. It's unheard of in the West, but it's part of the way that people socialize here, the way that food is a very important element of that socialization. And for families and guests and business partnership, they all emerge through restaurants and cafes and eating, and that's a very important role. Because there's so much work going on here, in a certain way they're much more open because, you know, we've done projects where there are 200 buildings being built in the next 5 years. So that means 200 different possibilities. In some place like Melbourne, you might have 3, maybe 4 major projects built a year or every 2 or 3 years. So it's limited, and I think people are more risk averse. You know, they know what works, and therefore they assume it. When you're suddenly having to complete multiple projects simultaneously, the opportunity for differences, for testing out new possibilities, is actually much more possible. China has the highest and the lowest level in terms of construction abilities. I mean, on the one hand, they have the most modern factories for glass and some fabrication technique, and yet half of the construction staff were farmers 6 months ago. So you're operating between these two spheres of quality, experience, and possibility. One major difference in China as an emerging market is that the briefs are not nearly as sophisticated as you might find in Australia or the West. I mean, in a certain way, they expect us to tell them what it is they need or what they want. And so whereas in Australia you might have a lot of market research, you might have a lot of backgrounding in terms of consumer advice and this, that. Here, somebody has a lot of money, or it's a development agency, and they have a plot of land that they purchased, which they know has a lot of value, and they want to develop something without necessarily having done market research. They just have a feel for what's successful, what's not successful, and you work from that, but oftentimes in conjunction with them to suggest where it might want to go to, particularly at the retail level. We tend to treat IP as something you just have to understand that we currently live in an incredibly visual community, and a lot of the ideas, architecturally speaking, seem to be transmitted by photographs and images, renderings and such, and the idea that you can hold on to it by what it looks like is very, very difficult because the minute it's reproduced one place, it's every place. So I don't think China's necessarily that different, although, you know, there are many occasions where people have done projects that didn't get built, and, you know, 2 years later they look in a magazine and it looks a lot like their project and it's built someplace else by somebody else. But I think you just have to take that on board. At the end of the day, there are differences in the way projects operate and the effects that they have in terms of the local condition, and you just deal with that. When you hire an employee in China, you can't just decide 6 months later you're going to get rid of them. There are very strong sort of labor laws that it's a serious commitment that if you take somebody on, you have to know that you just can't decide, even if there's a downturn, even if you have less business, you can't just let somebody go. You have to see that in a much longer term relationship and stuff. Having said that, we have very talented staff that come here. They're very well educated, but probably much more in a technocratic sense. They know how to dimension things, they know the rules, the regulations, but they may not have quite as much openness to possibility. So we have to work with them to show them that part of the way in which we work is not by knowing in advance what we want, but by discovering it through a design process. Sometimes we bring groups of staff to Melbourne and let them work in our office in Melbourne and get that sort of environment. But also I think our environment in our office in Shanghai, for instance, is probably more Western than a lot of offices that you would find. But even then, there are cultural differences in terms of hierarchy and respect and difference between seniority and junior staff, and which we don't have as much of in Australia, but still exists in China.